Wall was not made in spite of conflict. It was made entirely because of it. And the conflict that produced it was so deep, so personal, and so structurally irresolvable that the album's completion guaranteed the band's dissolution just as surely as it guaranteed its greatness. These two outcomes were not in tension with each other. They were the same outcome. Pink Floyd made The Wall the way a star makes light, by burning itself from the inside out. To understand what happened during the recording of The Wall, you have to understand what Pink Floyd had become by 1978. They were one of the most successful bands in the world. The Dark Side of the Moon had spent an almost incomprehensible amount of time on the Billboard charts. Wish You Were Here had been a critical and commercial triumph. Animals had divided the critics but sold enormously. By any external measure, Pink Floyd in 1978 was a band at the height of its powers. Internally, it was a band in the final stages of a slow collapse that had been building for years. The tension between Roger Waters and the rest of the band, and particularly between Waters and David Gilmour, had been intensifying with every album cycle. Waters had progressively consolidated creative control over the band's direction, its lyrics, its conceptual framework, and its public identity. By the time Animals was released, it was already difficult to describe Pink Floyd as a genuinely collaborative enterprise. It was, in all but name, Roger Waters' vehicle, with Gilmour, Wright, and Mason as increasingly peripheral contributors to a vision that belonged entirely to one man. What changed in 1979 was that Waters stopped pretending otherwise. The Wall was presented to the band not as a collaborative project, but as a fait accompli, a complete conceptual and narrative framework that Waters had developed independently, which the others were invited to execute. This was not collaboration. It was employment. And the psychological consequences of that shift were immediate, profound, and ultimately irreversible. Richard Wright bore the worst of it. Wright, the keyboard player whose atmospheric textures had been central to the band's sound since the beginning, whose contribution to Echoes, to Shine on You Crazy Diamond, to The Great Gig in the Sky, was arguably irreplaceable, was effectively fired during the recording of The Wall. Not publicly, not with any formal announcement, but through a process of progressive exclusion and humiliation that left him present in the studio, but functionally absent from the album. Waters had decided that Wright was not contributing sufficiently, was not working hard enough, was not meeting the standards that the project demanded. The irony, and it is a devastating one, is that Wright's keyboard parts on The Wall are among the most beautiful things on the record. The song, Comfortably Numb in particular, could not exist in its final form without what Wright contributed. He was fired from the band he had helped to found, while simultaneously recording some of the most important music of his career. Nick Mason fared better, but only marginally. Mason had never been the band's most technically assertive musician, and on The Wall, his limitations became a source of direct conflict with the album's producer, Bob Ezrin, who brought in session drummer Jeff Porcaro to play on several tracks. For Mason, a man who had been behind the kit for every Pink Floyd recording since the beginning, this was a specific and painful humiliation, the kind that leaves marks that fame and success cannot erase. He remained in the band, completed the album, and spent the following years existing in the increasingly narrow space that Waters left available for anyone who was not Waters. And then there was Gilmour. The relationship between Waters and Gilmour during the recording of The Wall was a masterclass in productive mutual contempt. These were two men who had fundamentally incompatible visions of what the album should sound like, what it should feel like, and what it should ultimately mean, and who were both right in ways that the other could not fully acknowledge. Waters wanted the album to be his confession, his indictment, his architectural vision of psychological collapse and political fury. Gilmour wanted it to be music, to have warmth, space, emotional accessibility, the quality of sound that makes an idea survivable rather than merely correct. Their conflict was not petty. It was not about ego in any simple sense. It was a genuine aesthetic disagreement between two people who understood music profoundly and understood it differently. The famous argument over the guitar solo in Comfortably Numb, Waters wanting something minimal, Gilmour refusing, is the most documented example of this dynamic. But it was not an isolated incident. It was the visible surface of a conflict that ran through every session, every arrangement decision, every mix. What makes the story of The Wall genuinely tragic, rather than merely dramatic, is that the conflict produced results that neither man could have produced alone. The album that emerged from those sessions is not the album that Waters would have made without Gilmour's resistance, and it is not the album that Gilmour would have made without Waters' vision. It is the product of two irreconcilable perspectives being forced by circumstance and contract and mutual stubbornness into a single recording. The tension that made the session so psychologically damaging is precisely the tension that made the music so emotionally devastating. You cannot separate the damage from the achievement. They are the same thing. Bob Ezrin, the producer brought in to manage this process, has described the sessions in terms that suggest less a recording studio than a psychological battlefield. His role was not primarily musical. It was diplomatic, therapeutic, and occasionally simply managerial. He mediated between Waters' totalizing vision and Gilmour's resistance to it. He managed Wright's progressive marginalization while extracting from him performances of genuine beauty. He worked with Mason on parts that were then supplemented or replaced by session musicians, navigating the politics of that process with the care of someone diffusing something explosive. That The Wall was completed at all under these conditions is remarkable. That it was completed as a coherent, emotionally overwhelming artistic statement is something close to inexplicable. The live performances that followed the album's release did nothing to heal what the recording had broken. The Wall tour, if it can be called a tour, given how few dates it actually played, was one of the most technically ambitious and personally revealing live productions in rock history. It was also, for the four men performing it, an experience that confirmed rather than resolved the fractures that had opened during the recording. Waters was increasingly the show's sole author and primary presence. The others were components of a production that was, fundamentally, his. By the end of the tour, the question was not whether Pink Floyd would survive. It was simply a matter of when the formal acknowledgement of what had already happened would arrive. That acknowledgement came in 1985, when Waters announced his departure from the band and declared, with characteristic directness, that Pink Floyd was a spent force. Gilmour and Mason disagreed, legally, publicly, and ultimately successfully, continuing under the Pink Floyd name, with albums that were commercially successful and critically divisive. Wright eventually returned, in a diminished capacity. The band that made The Wall had ceased to exist years before Waters made it official. What continued was something else. A brand, a catalogue, a set of sounds associated with a history that had ended. The Wall remains. And what it remains is the most precise document of its own creation that any album has ever produced. a record about isolation, about the walls people build between themselves and the world, made by four men who were, during its creation, building exactly those walls between themselves. The metaphor was not metaphorical. The psychological architecture that Waters was describing in the album's narrative was the psychological architecture of the sessions themselves. Pink Floyd did not illustrate the wall. They lived it, and the living of it cost them everything that the making of it achieved.